If you haven't been keeping up with the news, you might have missed it. Maryland and Baltimore City just slapped Glock with a lawsuit. The crazy part? Federal law is supposed to shield gun manufacturers from this kind of legal nonsense. But as usual, that hasn't stopped anti-gun politicians from pulling lawsuits out of thin air. In this video, we're going to break down why Glock is getting dragged into court by multiple states and cities. Now, say what you will about Glocks. They're not exactly winning beauty contests, and their outdated design leaves a lot to be desired these days. But let's be real, the gun world wouldn't be the same without them. Love 'em or hate 'em, they're still some of the most reliable pistols out there. And if you're pro 2A, watching them get steamrolled in court should set off some alarms. So, how did we get here? A couple of months ago, Minnesota and New Jersey launched lawsuits accusing Glock of making guns that are too easy to illegally modify. Those states make it sound as if Glock has some magical control over criminals who choose to break the law. Many folks believe this effort is part of a coordinated plan, possibly with some prodding from the White House, to sidestep the legal protections Congress explicitly passed to keep firearm manufacturers from getting buried by these nuisance lawsuits. Chicago's legal attack on Glock set the stage a while back, helped along by Everytown Law, which is connected to Michael Bloomberg's well-funded gun control network. Everytown Law has even published guides on how to sue members of the gun industry. That's a huge affront to what Congress intended, since lawmakers wanted to ensure firearm companies wouldn't be targeted and driven out of business just because criminals misuse guns. We read through the lawsuit. Maryland and Baltimore are making several allegations. They insist that Glock pistols can be easily turned into illegal automatic weapons with a small part known as a switch, and they allege that Glock has done nothing to prevent that. They point to the Glock 46, a model sold to certain law enforcement units in Europe, as proof the company could redesign its civilian guns if it really wanted to. They claim Glock promotes illegal modifications by advertising the full auto features of its G18 model and blame that for fueling demand among criminals looking to convert semi-automatic pistols. Their lawsuit seeks to halt Glock sales in Maryland unless the company revamps its pistols to be more resistant to illegal tinkering and sets up a fund to pay for gun violence intervention. Maryland and Baltimore officials want Glock to fork over money to programs in their jurisdictions, and they want the company to assume responsibility for the criminal acts of people who violate federal law by installing switches. These demands show the real intention behind the lawsuit. The anti-gun authorities aren't just asking Glock to tweak its design for the greater good, they're using the courts to shift blame away from the city's own crime problems. They're saying Glock should somehow anticipate how criminals might abuse the law, as if criminals wouldn't just find other methods or other brands to continue causing havoc. Critics of this lawsuit note that Baltimore and the state of Maryland have struggled to keep criminals off the streets, yet they're pointing the finger at a gun manufacturer instead of toughening up on violent offenders. The Maryland and Baltimore lawsuit leans heavily on Maryland's recently enacted public nuisance law, which lets the state hold firearm businesses accountable if they supposedly fail to exercise reasonable controls to prevent illegal misuse of their products. Maryland officials claim Glock knowingly contributes to public harm by leaving its civilian pistols too easy to convert with homemade or smuggled parts. They insist Glock has the means to guard against these modifications, but simply refuses to do so. According to them, that refusal shows Glock is encouraging or at least tolerating these dangerous alterations. It's a sweeping argument, and the complaint even labels Glock's actions a threat to public health and safety. The city and state want Glock to stop selling its modifiable pistols entirely and pay hefty sums to correct what they call a festering crisis. If that sounds familiar, it's because this approach has shown up in other lawsuits around the country. Chicago made a similar public nuisance claim, and states like Minnesota and New Jersey are doing the same thing. Their legal theory says that if you can imagine how a criminal might alter a product, the company has a duty to prevent it. Yet no one admits criminals will always devise new ways to break the law. Baltimore officials cite alarming statistics. They mention how the police have recovered more and more switched Glocks, that teens are carrying them, and that the city is suffering from violent incidents involving these illegally converted guns. Their main point is that Glock is somehow the reason behind all this mayhem, so the company should be held liable. The lawsuit describes an uptick in dangerous encounters in Baltimore where modified Glocks show up at crime scenes involving carjackings, street shootings, and narcotics trafficking. City officials talk about how underage individuals have been found with these altered pistols, sometimes right near schools or playgrounds. When you read through the city's complaint, you see pages of crime anecdotes, all used to bolster the narrative that Glock must be on the hook for the violence in Maryland's largest city. For example, a 42-year-old woman was caught in the crossfire near a Baltimore YMCA when her car was riddled with 18 bullets, while a 17-year-old suspect was arrested with a modified Glock after fleeing from a stolen vehicle. At a house party in March 2024, another victim suffered 5 gunshot wounds from an illegally altered Glock. The connection to drug trafficking is just as alarming. A 16-year-old was found in possession of a modified Glock along with heroin and fentanyl, and in April 2024, another suspect was caught with over 1,000 fentanyl pills and an illegally converted Glock. Even younger teens are entangled in this crisis, as 4 suspects between 15 and 17 years old were arrested in St. Mary's County with a modified Glock and 1,000 fentanyl pills in their possession. Adding to the problem, over 70% of arrests linked to modified Glocks involve prohibited possessors, including convicted felons and minors, many of whom were already wanted for violent crimes like murder, armed robbery, and drug trafficking. We've all noticed that Baltimore has been dealing with higher crime rates for quite a while, so it's suspicious that the city is pinning the blame on Glock as if removing a brand or design would solve the root problems. This lawsuit doesn't focus on the fact that criminals are still criminals, or that city and state authorities could take direct steps to reduce crime by enforcing existing laws more aggressively. It's simpler to drag Glock into court and demand that the company fund local initiatives. That tactic makes for good press releases about holding the industry accountable, but it doesn't put violent offenders behind bars or keep them there. Even some law enforcement officers have pointed out that criminals have countless methods to circumvent firearm regulations. Switching out parts, filing down critical areas, or even printing pieces on 3D printers isn't something Glock or any other manufacturer can magically stop. People who break the law will always look for new ways to do so. Congress enacted the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, or PLCAA, in 2005. Legislators intended to reinforce a well-known principle. A company lawfully producing and selling a product can't be held liable for the criminal acts of third parties who misuse that product. The PLCAA exists because activists wanted to bankrupt the firearm industry or force it to agree to gun control measures by threatening lawsuit after lawsuit. Lawmakers realized that these claims didn't have to win in court. They only had to be filed in large enough numbers to bury companies under legal costs. That's why the PLCAA was passed on a bipartisan basis almost 20 years ago. That hasn't stopped certain states and cities from searching for novel ways around the PLCAA. They passed new laws that label compliance with existing firearm regulations insufficient. They claim there's an additional requirement for reasonable controls. Then they file lawsuits alleging the companies didn't do enough to prevent criminals from breaking the law, even though those criminals also violated all sorts of federal and state statutes. It's a strategy that tries to get around the PLCAA's protections by reframing compliance with the law as something that's no longer enough. And this is happening now because of a precedent. Gun prohibition groups saw a major opening after the Sandy Hook tragedy in 2012. The firearm used in that atrocity was sold lawfully by companies that followed every rule on the books. Still, the plaintiffs claimed the way it was marketed violated a state consumer protection law because that marketing supposedly appealed to potential mass shooters. Even though the evidence was never tested in a full trial, Remington's insurers eventually settled to avoid massive legal expenses, and the company was forced into bankruptcy. To many gun control advocates, that was a goldmine of a strategy. Instead of needing to show a direct violation of firearm regulations, they just had to find some state law that could be twisted to imply wrongdoing. Now they try to replicate that approach in lawsuits against Glock and others, claiming the design or marketing of a firearm is an invitation to criminals. In this new wave of suits, the biggest target is any semi-automatic firearm that can be illegally converted to full auto. That includes most modern handguns and rifles, not just Glocks. Critics warn that if Glock caves, other manufacturers will be forced to comply with the same demands, creating a slippery slope that affects nearly every firearm sold in the civilian market. The real goal is often to strangle the lawful gun industry with litigation. It's not that the people pushing these lawsuits believe criminals will suddenly stop obtaining or modifying guns. They know criminals don't wait around for instructions. The idea is to keep filing cases until firearm companies either go bankrupt from legal costs or agree to adopt design changes that make guns virtually inaccessible to ordinary Americans. Meanwhile, criminals remain unaffected because they're already operating outside the law. If Glock or anyone else gave in and redesigned guns to the satisfaction of one state, another lawsuit would pop up with a whole new list of demands. That's exactly why the PLCAA was enacted, to prevent endless legal harassments from destroying lawful commerce in firearms. Pro-Second Amendment advocates see these lawsuits as an underhanded way for anti-gun politicians to pass the kind of bans they can't get through legislatures. It's no secret that politicians like Joe Biden have stated openly that eliminating liability protections for the gun industry is one of their top priorities. If they can't repeal the PLCAA in Congress, they'll just flood the courts with claims that reinterpret state laws to define any shortcoming, real or imagined, as a public nuisance. Maryland and Baltimore insist Glock should have designed its pistols so they can't be turned into illegal machine guns. They argue Glock ought to have foreseen that criminals would develop ways to install switches, 3D printed parts, or homemade modifications. Yet the truth is that any firearm can be illegally altered. People can remove serial numbers or saw off barrels. They can paint guns to appear like toys. They can attach or tape extra magazines together. The law already prohibits all these actions, but that isn't enough for folks eager to chase manufacturers into court. Plenty of people argue that if criminals wanted a fully automatic weapon, they'd find a method no matter what safety design Glock puts into place. The blame should lie with criminals, not with the makers of a legal product. That's where the whole notion of personal responsibility has apparently been cast aside. City attorneys claim the real villain is the gun's manufacturer, even though the manufacturer followed all state and federal statutes. Pro 2. A voices call that an absurd approach that bypasses actual accountability. The lawsuits against Glock are a stark reminder that anti-gun factions aren't giving up even when Biden, Harris, and the Democrat Party are in shambles. These lawsuits can be filed in any state where the political climate is friendly to their anti-gun agenda, looking for judges and laws they can exploit. They're also encouraging officials from other countries, like Mexico, to sue American gun companies over cartels committing crimes south of the border. Congress should revisit the PLCAA and strengthen its provisions. They want to block these attempts to twist the law's intent and bury gun makers under legal fees. Advocates of the PLCAA argue that if a city or state has a legitimate claim, like a company truly breaking the rules, they can still pursue it. But punishing a company because a criminal misused a legal product runs counter to everything that fair-minded law and justice should represent. There's plenty of hope that these lawsuits will ultimately fail, because federal law still carries a lot of weight, and many judges are skeptical of the argument that a manufacturer is liable for third-party crimes. But the legal battles can drag on for years, which is enough time to bankrupt or weaken a company. That's why Congress should firm up these protections. But that's it for this video. Lawsuits against Glock might grab headlines, and some politicians will pat themselves on the back for taking on big gun, but it won't address the real rot at the core of rising violence in places like Baltimore. Only tougher enforcement of existing laws and a commitment to punishing violent offenders will lower crime. But I digress. So, do you think these lawsuits carry weight? What are the chances of any of them winning, and why do you think any of them will win? Comment below. Please like, share, subscribe, and click on the bell icon for more of these videos. Thanks for watching.